So I think I'm a bit of an odd duck on stage today because I am an early stage guy, not a growth guy, and I'm an American, not a European. That said, I run a European venture capital fund. We're brand new. We're celebrating our second anniversary next week, so we're 2 years old. My business partner, again, hates when I say this, but I think we can confidently say that we don't suck. We actually have built a pretty good portfolio. We have 17 companies in the fund, 2 of which are very clearly on the path towards becoming unicorns. The first being Darktrace, and the second being Deliveroo. And we have a bunch of others that we were very early investors in, including Yieldify and Super Awesome, and then a little bit later with Lakestar and Algomi, which are actually turning out to be really great companies. Our whole fund thesis is that we invest in early stage companies, and in many cases we help them migrate over to the United States. Either they move or relocate to the US, or in many cases these days they just open up an office to the US. We're all pretty deeply connected to California. There are not that many firms that I think are in Europe. For instance, we did a deal in Sweden and we brought one of the Google board directors alongside of us, so the third angel investor in Google who took the board seat, and he co-invested with us. We sold that company over the summer. So we're pretty deeply connected. The other thing that's odd about us is we're very California in our approach. So we think about companies and we take excessive risk. So we back basically companies that we think are either going to make it into the billion-dollar status company or not make it at all and probably lose all of our money. So we're very happy with that level of risk. And we back things that we think are inventing brand new markets. So markets that don't exist, we tend to ask ourselves, why doesn't this exist today? Is there something that's underlying, that's changing? And so most of the things that we invest in are brand new market categories. So that's kind of us in a nutshell. So I talk a little bit about what I'm seeing that's changing in Europe. So the first, there's a lot of good news. I'm always accused as being the cynic in the crowd, as an American in London, and the guy who says, we're not quite good enough compared to Silicon Valley just yet. But I think things have really changed in the last 2 years, and there's a bunch of new funds like us that are also popping up into existence, which I think is very good for the European community. So the first is, here's some data. So today, about 15% of the unicorns founded after the year 2000, so these are a newer batch of companies, so at most they're 15 years old, are appearing in Europe. And if you contrast that to China, which is a huge market, right? It's about 22% in China, and about half of it's in the US. If you look at Israel or you look at India, it's tiny in comparison. And when you contrast this against the dollars that go into these companies, Europe is massively underfunded compared to everywhere else in the world. So it's actually a pretty interesting time to be a VC, because we're actually starting to see companies that are turning into very large companies, and there's very little money outside of probably the bigger funds that's chasing after that stuff. So that's the good news. And this is very different. If you looked at this about 5 years ago, it would be about 6% of the unicorns in the world would be. And I remember when we were doing our fundraising slide, we had to struggle to find a unicorn per year, and now pretty much every year you can find 2 or 3 in Europe. The other thing is these classic companies, I think in many ways are going global at a way different rate than they used to be in the past. So they're going global much faster than they used to be. And their ambitions in many cases include taking over the US market. So you have Lending Club in the US, which has done very well, but you have Funding Circle that's right on the heels, and to be fair, I think can become a bigger company and a better company than Lending Circle. Supercell has a huge audience in the US. TransferWise is gunning for the US market. FanDuel, which is this little company in Scotland, is going head-to-head against DraftKings, and the US is a big thing. They just got banned this week by the New York Attorney General. So you have a whole class of companies that are not scared of tackling the US market, and then you have another class of companies that are tackling a global market, which, to be fair, the US just doesn't matter for them. So, we're an investor in Deliveroo. Deliveroo, moves food from one place to, from a restaurant to your house. They rely on city density, and because they rely on city density, there are 51 cities in Europe that are as dense as Chicago in the US. Just doesn't make sense for them to be in the US because they run a much better operating model in Europe and the rest of the world. And so they're leaving the US to DoorDash and completely ignoring those guys because they have a better economic model out here. So the scale is much better than before, and the level of ambition is much better, and the global domination is much better, which is great for a venture fund. The other thing that's changed is in the US, and this was kind of our fund thesis, was there was a whole generation of new micro venture funds that started. And you can see this, the fund that started in 2005 with folks like First Round Capital and Baseline. And it's there are 100 new venture funds that are projected to exist in that micro VC category in the US just this year. And Europe sometimes is a little bit late to the game, but you can see there are 2 of these in 2009, and they're 39 today. So Europe is kind of following the same exact trajectory. So venture has all of a sudden become pretty hot, and micro venture, or very early stage venture, has also become really hot. And so who are these folks? So these are the guys in the US. You can see the pioneers. It's the baseline ventures, the floodgates, the first round capitals, the Union Squares. All of these are now household names to us. There's a whole generation of other micro venture funds that are very established. There are a bunch of folks who only focus on specific sectors. So they only do e-commerce, they only do digital commerce, or they only do software as a service. And then there are a bunch of guys who've seen this movie inside of bigger funds and said, if my buddies are building great funds, why don't I leave my boring old big firm and go do a next generation fund? And so you're seeing a bunch of spin-outs from top tier VCs who are leaving their firms, usually the younger generation of folks, and building their own firms. And the same exact thing is now happening in Europe. So here's the European slide equivalent. Not as dense as the American slide, but remember I said there are 39 of these firms raising money right now. So a whole bunch of these are going to end up, this chart's going to fill up. And so you see the Mosaics and the Felixes. You see Notion as the software as a service. You see a bunch of the pioneers in the middle. And then we're up there on the left-hand side as one of the newer upstarts as well. The other big news that's happening in Europe, which is very, very different, is the funding ecosystem has fundamentally changed. So if you look at how European companies historically were funded at the early stage, they were almost drip-fed. And this slide's a little bit busy, but what you can see is at the very bottom, you see the old generation of unicorns, and at the top, you see the newer generation of unicorns. And you see in the old generation, every kind of loop over there is a fundraising round, right? So FanDuel raised a small amount, 100K, then they raised $1 million, then they raised about 4 million, then they raised about 11 or 12 million, and then they raised their big mega round. Same thing goes for TransferWise, same thing goes for Klarna. If you look at the newer generation of unicorns, the BlaBlaCars, the Deliveroo's, the Delivery Heroes, they're doing a small seed round, and then they're going straight to a bigger Series A round, and then they're going straight on to their kind of mega rounds. It's very, very, very similar to what's happening in America. So Europe has, for the first time, I think, is caught up to what's happening in America. And this is a structural, massive change in the early stage market. You just didn't see this 5 years ago. And it means that there's a bunch more interest and a bunch more capital chasing it. So this is what I wanted to present. I think this is a great time to be in Europe. I think the scale of ambition is fantastic. I think the companies are fantastic. And I think we're going to see more and more of these winners and a bunch more funds kind of like us pop up in the latter half of this decade. Thank you.